Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I hope all of you enjoyed Prince, the one and only. He's amazing. He's a Minnesotan. I love Prince. We're so glad to have you here today on behalf of CSU Extension. And thanks for letting us know where you're chatting in from. That's amazing to see people across the country join us for this webinar. And we hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you're coming from. My name is Allison O'Connor. I am an extension professor of horticulture here in Colorado. My colleagues are Amy Lentz, who's an extension specialist in horticulture up in Weld County, which is just east of me in northern Colorado. And then we also have our extension turfgrass specialist, Dr. Tony Koski, who's joining us from campus. And I will introduce our speaker momentarily. She is the one who is purple, and we'll go ahead and get started. Just a couple of notes before we do get started. CSU is an equal opportunity access and non-discrimination university. If there is anything we can do to accommodate your needs, please do let us know, and we are happy to try to help you as best we can. Also, there's a lot of people on this webinar, and we understand if you can't make it all the way through, just know that it is being recorded, and you can find this class and all of our other recorded classes at our cohort blog, which is csuhort.blogspot.com. Amy or Tony will pop that into the chat after we get started so that you can visit that. You can sign up for future webinars. We do these webinars every Wednesday Mountain Time on the second, or not every Wednesday, sorry, the second Wednesday of each month, Mountain Time at noon. And you can see that we have a great schedule of classes still to come. Everything else that you have seen, if you missed squirrel management in January, you can catch that on the cohorts blog. So without further ado, I will introduce to you Lisa Mason. Lisa Mason is an extension horticulture specialist from Arapahoe County. So she's just in the southern part of the Denver metro area. Lisa has a background in entomology and a passion for pollinators. And so this is a wonderful session, and we're so pleased that Lisa could be here. So without further ado, Lisa Mason.
Thank you all for joining us today. I'm so excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is pollinators. So let's dive right in. If you're not familiar with Colorado State University Extension, we are the outreach branch of the university. Our job is to bring our science-based education to the community. So if you're not familiar with your local extension, even if you're not in Colorado, check out your state. Land-grant universities are nationwide, and you have an extension office near you. In terms of horticulture services, reach out to us. We provide technical assistance around diagnostics, site visits. We field inquiries from the public all the time on plants, insects, trees, lawns, vegetable gardening, you name it. And we do public programs and presentations. I posted the gardening webinars here one more time in case you didn't see it, and the extension websites. All right, so today we're going to talk about why pollinators are important. Who are some of the pollinators? We're going to talk a little bit about wasps because those questions always come up. We'll talk about how beekeeping plays a role with pollinators, and then we'll talk about pollinator habitats. So let's talk about big picture. If insects were wiped out on the planet, humans would not be able to survive. Famous biologist and naturalist E.O. Wilson estimates humans wouldn't be able to survive more than a few months without insects on our planet. And insects provide a wide variety of services for us. Most of the time, we don't even think about the services that they are providing for us. Excuse me. For instance, the predators that feed on pests. Imagine a world without dung beetles, recycling dung back into the soil. They prevent soil erosions through the plants they pollinate. The benefits are just absolutely endless. But today we're going to talk specifically about the benefits of pollinators. And insects and arthropods, including pollinators, are declining, especially some of the smaller species and species that are specialists that need specific ecosystems to thrive. Mostly they're declining because of habitat loss. They don't have those habitat spaces that they used to. but there are a variety of other reasons why some of our pollinator and insect populations are declining. And why do we care? Well, from a human perspective, pollinators provide about 1/3 of the human diet. So 1 in every 3 bites of food comes from crops that were pollinated by pollinators. Bees alone will pollinate up to $15 billion worth of crops each year. That translates to about 80 different crop species. And it goes beyond just fruits, vegetables, and nuts. So think about the cattle industry. Cattle feed on alfalfa and clover, which are pollinated by bees. So pollinators really are connected in so many ways. In terms of an ecosystem perspective, pollinators will pollinate about 75% or more of all the plants in the world. So imagine a world without 75% of our plant species. And most people are familiar with the honeybee, which is one species that we have. We'll talk more about it. But we also have a variety of specialist relationships. So pollinators have specialist relationships with the plants that they pollinate. A few examples to highlight are bumblebees. Bumblebees do something called buzz pollination, meaning when they land on the plant, they have a special vibration that releases the pollen from those plants. They commonly pollinate the vegetables in the Solanaceae family. So our nightshades like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. Blueberries are another example of a plant that needs to be buzz pollinated. Cactus bees. Now, if you haven't watched flowers and if you have not watched cactus flowers, I highly recommend. They're going to start blooming here in Colorado soon. Pause and watch the activity in those flowers. You will see all kinds of biodiversity. But specifically, there are some bees that rely on cactus flowers to complete their life cycle and to survive. Another great example are squash bees. So squash bees are a bee that is native to North America. And it's one of those things, you plant the squash and pumpkins and the bees will come. They're ground nesting bees. And if you get up early in the morning, look inside those squash flowers, you'll see the squash bees. And they're up early, they're efficient, and they usually have the job done by the time the honeybees even wake up. So we love our pumpkin and squash bees. And another unique example that I think is worth mentioning are yucca plants. Yucca moths pollinate yucca plants, and they have a very symbiotic relationship. One cannot survive without the other. So if you have yucca in your landscape, you can thank the yucca moths because they're keeping those yuccas pollinated. And what is pollination? So pollination, in short, is facilitating plant reproduction. Now I could teach a whole class on exactly this, but for the purposes of this presentation, the bees visit the flowers, and they are visiting those flowers for the pollen and nectar reward. That little bee, she has no idea she's doing the plant any favors. Plants have evolved to attract their pollinators through colors, scent, through the markings that, basically are like runways, like come to this flower, there's lots of pollen and nectar. And when she visits that flower, pollen grains are deposited on her body. So then she'll fly to the next flower. And in that process, some of those pollen grains will be deposited on the stigma, which is the female part of the flower, and thus facilitating plant reproduction. And this is what happens when we don't have efficient pollination. We just don't get the ripe fruit development that we are used to. Now I'm going to talk quite a bit about bees, but I do want to acknowledge all of our other non-bee pollinators that are just as important. So let's walk through some of them that you might see in your own landscape. Birds. So in Colorado specifically, hummingbirds are our main bird pollinators. They visit a wide variety of flowers, and look at this photo. This is a female broad-tailed hummingbird. She's got pollen grains on the top of her head. Hummingbirds tend to visit red, long tubular flowers, and they feed on other insects. So planting native plants and nectar flowers can attract a wide variety of hummingbirds to your landscape. Wasps. Now, not all wasps are pollinators, but we do have species that do pollinate flowers. Specifically in this photo here are a group of wasps called pollen wasps. Now, most wasps feed on other insects. Some will feed on carrion or dead things, but pollen wasps are a group of vegetarian wasps that feed on pollen and nectar just like bees do. So this time of year, if you see these pointy little abdomens hanging out of penstemon flowers, there's a good chance you might be looking at pollen wasps. Flies. Now, flies, just like wasps, there's a huge amount of diversity in the insect order of flies, many of which are pests that, like mosquitoes, but we also have specific families that are flower visiting flies. And so you'll commonly see these. These can be bee flies, like you see in the picture here. And it can also be syrphid flies or hover flies. And really, syrphid flies provide double benefits. They can pollinate the flowers, but the larvae also feed on soft-bodied insects like aphids. So we love our flower visiting flies. Butterflies are a popular pollinator you might see in your landscape. Here in Colorado, we have about 250 species. They're attracted to bright colored nectar flowers and often go for flowers that have a landing platform for them. So we'll talk more about butterflies. If you want to know more about butterflies in your state, if you're not from Colorado, I highly recommend visiting butterfliesandmoths.org. You can actually look, there's species list for all the counties, and you can look and see what butterflies are in your state. Beetles can also pollinate. Many beetles are also insect predators, and especially in the fall, you'll start to see beetles feeding on nectar and pollen from different flowers. This is a soldier beetle on some rabbit brush here. And so when they go from flower to flower, they may also help pollinate. Moths can also be pollinators. In this picture here, we have the white-lined sphinx moth, which is one type of, in Colorado, we have about 30 species of sphinx moths. So this is the white-lined sphinx moth is one of the most common ones. And they're going to visit white or pale-colored flowers that open up at night. And look at these long spurs. They have a long tongue called the proboscis and love flowers that have those long spurs. Many of you have probably experienced an influx of miller moths this time of year. Believe it or not, miller moths can sometimes be pollinators as well. They're hanging out here on the Front Range of Colorado because we've had such cool, rainy weather, and there's an abundance of flowers available for them to feed on. But not to worry, they will migrate to the mountains here soon. And then the last type of pollinator I want to mention are bats. So bats are also great predators of pest insects, and many bat species also are pollinators. If you go a little bit further south, bats pollinate the agave plant, which is how they make tequila. So you happen to enjoy a good margarita, be sure you thank the bats for pollinating the agave plants. All right, let's talk about bees. We have an enormous amount of bee diversity in our world. 20,000 species worldwide, 4,000 species in North America, and here in Colorado, we have 946 species of bee. Absolutely amazing. Since we're only familiar with mostly only familiar with the honeybee, we're going to talk about the life cycles of all the other bees you may come across in your own landscape. And this is applicable nationwide, or pretty much anywhere in the world as well. There's 3 life cycles for bees that we're going to talk about. And the first one is eusocial bees. So here in North America, that is primarily our honeybees. So we have one species of honeybee. This is actually a non-native insect. We brought honeybees to the United States back in the 1600s. And this is an important distinction. Honeybees are a managed and domesticated species. So just like livestock, we breed honeybees. Beekeepers can buy honeybees. If a beekeeper loses their hives over the winter, they can buy new bees or maybe catch a swarm or split one of their other hives. So this is an important distinction when we talk about all the other wild bees, because wild bees are at risk of species decline or even potentially for some species, even extinction. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But honeybees are really the only eusocial bee in North America, and they're defined by 3 characteristics. They have overlapping generations within the hive. They have a reproductive division of labor, which means the queen honeybee, she is the only one that lays eggs. Honeybees are very altruistic. It is about the survival of the colony, not the survival of the individual. And those bees, they protect that queen. And they also have something called cooperative brood care, which means when honeybees reach a certain age, their job is to tend and feed the baby bees that are still larvae within the hive. Most of the time with honeybees, you're going to find them in human-made hives because we take care of honeybees, we manage them. Occasionally, you may come across a feral colony inside a hollowed out tree or other cavity space. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have our solitary nesting bees, and they have a dramatically different life cycle. The only time they interact with other bees is really when they're looking for a mate. So let's walk through their life cycle. Spring is here. The bees are emerging from their underground nest. They're going to find a mate. The females are going to visit flowers for pollen and nectar, and she's going to find a site to build a new nest. This is going to be underground or in a pre-existing cavity, and she's going to pack that pollen and nectar into a tight ball, and then she'll deposit 1 egg on that bee bread. Then she'll seal up the nest cell. That little egg, this little larva, has all the provisions it needs to grow and become an adult bee. So her brood will overwinter. Solitary bees live a 1-year life cycle. So when fall and winter comes, her life cycle will come to an end, but all her brood is protected underground or in a cavity nest for the following spring. So here's some examples of ground nesting bees emerging from their nests. 70% of all solitary bees nest underground. The other 30% nest in pre-existing tunnels. So when you think about all 20,000 species of bees worldwide, approximately 90% of those bees are solitary. Only about 10% of the bees are social. So here's some examples of bee nests you may come across. Human-made bee hotels are a great option. You might come across holes in the ground. And I think when we see holes in the ground, we automatically assume, oh, there must be an ant colony there. But I challenge you, when you see holes in the ground, pause and watch who's going in and out of those holes, because you may have ground nesting bees in your area. And some bees will actually excavate pithy or hollowed out stems. This is a small carpenter bee inside a twig. Here is what it looks like in a cavity nest. So here we have the bee bread. We've got larvae feeding on the bee bread, and then we have a pupa. All bees go through full metamorphosis, just like butterflies and moths. So this is their pupa stage before they become an adult bee. Okay, so we talked about eusocial bees. We talked about solitary bees. Let's talk about that third life cycle. And that's right in the middle. We call it primitively eusocial. This means that the bees share characteristics of solitary bees and social bees. And this category comprises all of our bumblebees. Bumblebees have a unique life cycle as well. And in my opinion, queen bumblebees are the hardiest bees around because they're the only bees that will actually hibernate as an adult bee. The honeybees are warm inside their colony. It could be 0 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but it'll be 90 degrees Fahrenheit inside their hive. All the other solitary bees are protected underground, but queen bumblebees are hibernating in a pile of leaves or other debris where they'll be protected all winter. Very hardy bees. So spring is here. The queens are flying. I'm seeing 1 or 2 almost every day. And she's going to collect pollen and nectar and find a hollowed out cavity space to build her nest. She's going to lay generations of worker female bees, and they'll keep that colony growing. About midsummer, she's going to lay eggs that are new queens and new males. Those bees will leave the colony, they will search and find a mate. And then once winter comes, this current colony will come to an end, and the only survivors will be those newly mated queens. So they also live a 1-year life cycle in a hollowed out space underground, like our solitary bees, but they also have social characteristics of having that queen, having the worker bees, and having that colony. So very cool. Okay, here's your pop quiz for the day. Look at each of these photos and think to yourself, am I a bee, a fly, or a wasp? I'll give you about 10 seconds. Okay, with time, we're gonna keep going. Let's look at the answers. The first 5 photos on the slide are all flies. I know, you're probably all floored. I intentionally chose flies that mimic bees. Flies mimic bees and wasps because bees and wasps are stinging insects. So if they look like a stinging insect, predators will avoid them, humans included. So we see a lot of bee mimics visiting flowers. And we're going to talk about the differences here in just a second. Wasps, long, narrow bodies. This is a sand wasp right here that will often visit flowers for nectar. And then these last 2 photos are bees. So let's talk about why and how you can tell the difference in your own garden. So wasps have long, narrow bodies, very little hair, long, usually curly antennae, and they do not carry pollen. Wasps also have a constriction between their thorax and the abdomen. On many species, it looks like someone went and pinched their waist there. Bees also have this, but it's much more pronounced in wasps. Wasps also have 2 pairs of wings. When we look at flies versus bees, these are the 2 characteristics I want you to look for. Look at these giant fly eyes. The eyes almost go to the top of the head. On bees and wasps, their eyes are more on the sides of their head. So the eyes can be a giveaway characteristic right away. The other thing you'll notice when you're observing insects on flowers are these short, stubby antennae. Bees and wasps have long antennae. A couple other things you may notice, flies also have 1 pair of wings. Most flies, not all, don't have hairs like bees do, and flies will not carry pollen on their bodies either. So bees tend to be a little bit more round and robust, and their bodies have a lot of hair on them, so they just looked a little bit more compact sometimes. Their eyes are well on the sides of their head. They have long antennae. Oftentimes you'll see the bend in the antenna, and they're going to carry pollen 1 of 2 ways. The first way is bumblebees and honeybees will actually carry pollen balls in their pollen baskets on their hind legs. See this honeybee here? She's got these widened hind legs. That's where her pollen baskets are. We call those orbiculae. All the other wild bees or native bees will carry pollen through special pollen collecting hairs, either on their hind legs or on the underside of their abdomen usually. Bees can be all sizes, shapes, and colors. So let's look at our answer key here. And I love these photos, like this fly right here, the second photo in. Look at the size of the abdomen. It almost looks like this insect has special pollen collecting hairs on the hind legs. But those markings are to mimic bees. So very impressive. This one here on the right is still a fly, I promise. Look at those giant fly eyes and short, stubby antenna. So this is a fly that mimics a yellow jacket. This bottom left-hand corner, I thought it was a bumblebee too. But look at those eyes and the antenna. And you can actually tell here that there's only 1 pair of wings as well. So pretty impressive for flies to be able to mimic bees and wasps like that. So in all the fly photos, you'll notice the giant fly eyes and the short, stubby antenna. Here in our wasp, you'll notice the long, narrow body, not carrying any pollen, no hairs, that kind of thing. And then the last 2 photos are bees. Now, these are a little bit tricky. This here, the second in from the left is a wool carder bee, actually a non-native bee. It's from Europe. You see wool carder bees all over lamb's ear because the females will scrape plant fuzz and she'll line her nest with the plant fuzz. She's got special pollen collecting hairs on the underside of her abdomen. And then this bee right here, this red one, this was a trick question because this is a bee, but not a pollinator. So we have several genera of bees that are cuckoo bees, which means they're parasite bees. They will actually seek out a host bee nest and she'll lay her eggs in the host bee nest. And those eggs, when they hatch, they will either kill the native bee larva or they will eat all the food. And so cuckoo bees don't need to pollinate. You'll see them visit flowers for nectar, but they actually aren't pollinators and they don't really have hairs on their bodies either. So what a diversity. Here's a couple other bee mimics that I think are really interesting. On the left here, we have the Hunt's bumblebee, which has those orange bands on the abdomen. On the right, here is a robber fly mimicking a bumblebee, and it even has the orange bands on the abdomen. But you can tell, by the hairs on this bumblebee, the antenna, look at the eyes on the fly and the antenna on the fly, the differences between a fly and a bee. And I love this photo. This is a brand new photo that I added for today. In the bottom left, we have a honeybee. In the top right, we have a fly that mimics a honeybee. So again, you gotta look closely at those characteristics. Look at these giant fly eyes and short stubby antenna. So pretty impressive. Now here are some examples of bees that you'll see in your own landscape. Now, we don't have time to dive into all the different types of bees today, but I want to give you an idea of the diversity. Top left, we have a small carpenter bee in a vines weed flower. That's how tiny this little bee is. Look at the pollen on her hind legs too. All the way to, here we have a sunflower bee, and look at all the yellow pollen on her hind legs. That's a great example of special pollen collecting hairs called scopae on the hind legs. We have leafcutter bees. So look at, she has special pollen collecting hairs on the underside of her abdomen. And we have sweat bees. So sweat bees can be green, they can be black, they can be metallic black. Here in this picture though, you can see they all have special pollen collecting hairs on their hind legs. So quite a variety. If you're interested in learning more about this and you want to learn to identify bees at a more in-depth, we do run a community science program here in Colorado called Native Bee Watch. Registration is still open. We'll give you all the training materials and you can watch flowers in your own landscape. So visit nativebeewatch.org. Right now, this program is just in Colorado, but the materials are applicable to almost anywhere. So if you're from out of state and you still want to learn more about bees, check out nativebeewatch.org for those materials. And feel free to email me if you have questions. All right. We are going to switch gears and talk a little bit about stings. This is a very important question, especially when we think about adding pollinator habitat to our landscapes. So here in Colorado and much of the West, over 90% of all insect stings are from the Western yellow jacket. So I'll say that again, over 90% of all stings are from the Western yellow jackets. Honeybees can sting if they are provoked. Wasps can sting multiple times, but honeybees, they actually have a little barb at the end of their stinger. So when they sting you and they try to fly away, that barb stays in your skin and essentially kind of rips the guts out of that little honeybee. So, and they cannot survive from that. So honeybees don't want to sting. They sting if you accidentally step on them or if you really provoke them. Now, native bees, so solitary bees, and this goes for solitary wasps too. The males cannot sting. The females can sting, but it is incredibly difficult to get stung by a solitary bee or a solitary wasp. You pretty much have to handle them to get stung. They will never fly around your barbecue while you're sitting outside. They keep to themselves, and most of the time, we don't even notice that they are there. So when we think about creating pollinator habitat, this is really important because Western yellow jackets don't visit flowers for nectar. They actually feed on carrion. They're scavengers. So they're going to look for dead things, and they also happen to be attracted to human food sources. So creating pollinator habitat really doesn't raise the risk of stings, hardly at all. Really, it's those yellow jackets that tend to be a nuisance wasp. Speaking of yellow jackets, let's talk about that a little bit more. So they are scavengers, and when the temperatures start to cool down, they know food is scarce, and they tend to get more and more aggressive. So the vast majority of the time when you have a yellow and black stinging insect flying around you, and there's food around, your barbecue, sugary sodas, those kinds of things, trash cans, most of the time it is a Western yellow jacket. Now, Western yellow jackets nest underground. So oftentimes their nests are hard to find, unless it is very close to human activity. And so what do you do with Western yellow jackets? You can put out those yellow tube pheromone traps out in the very early spring. So Western yellow jackets and European paper wasps have the same life cycle traits as a bumblebee. So the current colonies from this year that are active right now will not survive the winter, and the only survivors will be newly mated queens. So next spring, those new queens will find a new place and build a nest all over again. So that's important. So if you put out those pheromone traps early in the spring, maybe you'll catch some of the queens before they build a colony. Be sure you get pheromone traps only, because you look at places like Amazon, there's a lot of traps that use sugar and UV lights. That's a catch-all. That's going to attract all the good bees, all the insects you want in your landscape. So make sure for yellow jackets you're using that pheromone. If you have a nest and it is too close to human activity and there's a high risk of stings, it's really best to contact a professional to remove that nest, because that nest is so well protected through layers and layers of paper that putting wasp spray in an underground nest is not going to kill hardly any. There are insecticidal dusts out there where they can track it into the colony, but again, the effectiveness may help, maybe not. And since yellow jackets can be aggressive when their nest is threatened, especially, it's best to hire a professional. So this is our first nuisance wasp. We're going to talk about one more nuisance wasp, and then we're going to move on to all the fun wasps. The other wasp that can be a nuisance is the European paper wasp. Now, remember, I said 90% of the stings were actually yellow jackets. And that is very true. Where European paper wasp stings happen is when they build a nest on human infrastructure. We don't know the nest is there. Like, we open a dark shed and boom, there's a nest there. That's when stings tend to happen with the European paper wasp. They keep to themselves. They visit flowers for nectar, but the only time they will sting is when they feel like their nest is threatened or you really provoke them. This is an invasive species. So this invasive species has dramatically altered our garden ecosystems because they feed on caterpillars, both pest caterpillars, but also beneficial caterpillars like our butterflies. So they've just dramatically altered our garden ecosystem. They're going to build those open-faced papery nest cells under house eaves, in a shed, any dark location that they can find. So what do? Yellow jacket traps will not work for these wasps. So, and since these wasps have the open-faced papery nest cells, you can actually, this is where wasp sprays can be a good control option. If you do use something like a wasp spray, be sure to do it at night and follow the directions explicitly, because you don't want to harm other insects if you're using wasp spray, and you don't want to get stung either. After you remove a European paper wasp nest, be sure you hose down that area really well, because otherwise the scent of that nest is going to linger. And if there's any survivors, they will start building a new nest. Okay, so those are the two nuisance wasps. Now, all the other wasps that I'm going to mention real quick we hardly even know they're there. But wasps provide us wonderful benefits of controlling pests in our gardens. And these two next wasps can be a little bit alarming if you notice their nest. They build the iconic papery funnel nest, usually high up in a tree. So most of the time people actually don't know they're there until all the leaves fall off the tree. Well, by that point, just like the other wasps, they cannot survive the winter. The only survivors will be the new queens. So if you don't notice a papery nest until fall or winter, well, that colony's done. So you really don't have to worry too much. And the wasp nest will disintegrate over time. It's likely to be a bald-faced hornet or an aerial yellow jacket. So again, most of the time people don't notice they're there. The only time they would sting really is if their nest is threatened. So if you hire an arborist or you have kids climbing in a tree and you have a wasp nest there, that's not a good idea to climb that tree if there's a nest there. But otherwise, they really just keep to themselves and prey on pests in our gardens. Control options, well, you really don't need to control these unless the nest is too close to human activity. So if you've got kids climbing that tree, it might be a good idea to contact a professional to get that nest removed. But if it's high in a tree, it's probably not going to bother anyone unless you have people in that tree. And then in addition to that, we have thousands and thousands of other wasps in our gardens and in our landscapes. Just doing their thing. They are not going to sting unless you try to handle them or unless they're pressed up against your skin. And they provide valuable pest control services. So some of the fun ones you might come across on this bottom photo right here is a mason or potter wasp. Solitary nesting wasp that uses mud and pebbles. This red one, I took this just a couple of weeks ago. This is an Ichneumon wasp. She was likely looking for prey over some of the rocks in my garden. Here we have a black and yellow mud dauber. These wasps are spider hunters. Occasionally you might notice some mud tunnels like attached to your house, and those are probably mud dauber nests. Don't worry, they won't hurt you. And once they all emerge, you can just use I can't think of the word. You can basically pluck them off of your house. They won't do any harm. Top right is a sand wasp. These are great hunters and they nest in sandy areas. And then this bright green wasp is actually a cuckoo wasp that is looking to parasitize other solitary wasps. Solitary wasps can hunt spiders, crickets, caterpillars, and other insects. Sometimes you may find solitary wasps in your bee hotel. That is totally great because solitary nesting wasps won't bother humans. So it's a unique opportunity to see the wasp life cycle in action without any risk of getting stung. They don't compete the bees. They don't harm the bees. Solitary bees and solitary wasps coexist very well. So here's a photo from a master gardener in Denver. This is a grass carrying wasp. So this little wasp is putting grass blades in her nest, and she will bring crickets back to the nest for her larva. Okay, we're switching gears again. Beekeeping. So a common misconception is that beekeeping is the best way to save the bees. Well, a great analogy would be raising honeybees to save the bees is similar to raising chickens to save the birds. So again, honeybees are a domesticated species. We hear a lot in the media about colony losses, honeybee colony losses. Honeybee colony losses does not equate to bee decline. Colony losses for beekeepers is very steep, usually anywhere from 30 to 60%. And that means that those beekeepers lost a lot of colonies, likely due to mites, maybe starvation, weather, but the beekeeper can replace those bees. So it's expensive to lose honeybee hives. And honeybees have a variety of challenges, but in terms of like bee decline and population decline, it's very separate. So let me know if there are questions about that. Beekeeping can be a wonderfully rewarding hobby. It takes 12 bees their entire lives to make 1 teaspoon of honey. So think about that next time you make a cup of tea. They're hardworking insects. Beekeepers can also get beeswax and other products from the hive. They are very efficient pollinators for many of our crops and non-native flowers. It can be rewarding, very educational, but beekeeping isn't necessarily for everyone either. And especially if you want to help save the wild bees, it's actually best to provide flowers and habitat spaces for those wild pollinators versus raising honeybees. Some things to consider before you start beekeeping: the time commitment. You cannot have a hive and just let it do its thing. Just like any managed species or pets, beekeeping needs constant maintenance, to do hive inspections, to feed them sugar syrup, among other things. It can be an expensive hobby too. It can be upwards of $500 to even $1,000 just to get started. You do have a risk of stings. There's great safety equipment to help prevent stings, but it's always still possible. And then beekeeping, there's a steep learning curve. They have a mind of their own and a variety of challenges like varroa mites. So there is definitely challenges and a learning curve. If you're thinking about getting started, be sure you check your local ordinance. Most of the municipalities, and if you definitely check if you're in an HOA too, have guidelines around beekeeping. You'll also want to be a good neighbor and educate your neighbors too. You know, honeybees really only sting if they're provoked. Most people say, "Ow, I was stung by a bee," but in reality, a lot of times it was from a wasp. You want to provide water to your honeybees. Without a doubt, we always get calls. I have all these bees that appeared in my hot tub. Why, and where did they come from? Bees will go to the nearest water source. So, and this goes for all pollinators. If you want to support them, they all need water. You can get shallow dishes, bird baths. Those are great. Make sure you seal your equipment. Do your research. Join a local beekeeping club. Again, you can't just let a hive be, because it does need maintenance and management to stay as healthy as possible. We talked about colony losses. By far, one of the biggest challenges with honeybees are varroa mites. And these days, you pretty much have to treat. Good practice is to do mite counts once a month and treat for those mites to help them be able to survive the winter. We're still a little bit in swarm season. If you see a bee swarm like this, no need to panic. Bee swarms happen when the bees outgrow their hive. There's not enough room. So they feed up on all the honey and they grab the queen and they leave. They will cluster in an area like a tree or other infrastructure. And during that time, they're actually very docile. It would be very hard to get stung from a bee swarm because they don't have a hive to protect. They send out little scout bees to find a permanent home. So if you see a swarm, tell people around you, don't panic, call the swarm hotline, because there's a long list of beekeepers that would love to come and get those bees. We talked about, is beekeeping the best way to save the bees? The short answer is no, but it really depends on your goals as well. So honeybees can provide great pollination services. They're very important economic crop pollinator, but we also want to support all our other pollinators as well. So think about the goals of your own property. If you're managing open spaces or your goals are conservation oriented, it's probably best to plant flowers and support all the wild pollinators. If you have a small farm or crops that are pollinated by honeybees, you want the honey and you want that experience, maybe beekeeping is right for you. So there's a lot of different caveats on that. And one of the big questions is competition between honeybees and native bees. And more research is coming out about this, but the short answer, this is a very nuanced and complex question. So that's why we got to think about managing our lands very carefully. And is it appropriate to have honeybees or not? Again, conservation-oriented goals in that land, save the wild resource, the flowers for the wild bees. But if you're in an urban setting or an agricultural setting where it may make sense to have honeybees, that's great too. And in an urban setting, we have lots of floral resources available usually. So Supporting honeybees might not be as much competition for the native bees in that case. So there's no easy answer. So think about what your own goals are. And the take-home message is all bees are important. We need all the bees. So I hate to see people take sides. Just think about what your own goals are for the land you're managing. All right, we are at 12:47. Let's dive into pollinator habitat real quick. Pollinator habitats, just like all animals, they need food, water, shelter, and space. So when you're looking at food, flowers to provide for all the pollinators, make sure you're planting a diversity of species. Each plant has a different nutritional profile, and so diversity is key. Make sure you're planting blooms all season long. So from the very early spring to the very latest fall, bees need and pollinators need that support the whole entire time. So you can plan your garden carefully by the bloom or when your plants bloom. Avoid double flowers. So double flowers are plants that were bred by horticulturalists to be big, bright, and beautiful. And the result is you get this lovely flower that lasts, has a long bloom time. But what you don't have is pollen and nectar resources for insects. So they're basically sterile plants. When they make double flowers, the plant reproductive parts essentially become more petals. And so it's a fine line. Double flowers are absolutely gorgeous. Plant some of those, but maybe make sure you're adding some pollinator-friendly plants as well to your landscape. Native flowers are wonderful for all the native pollinators. You can't go wrong. There's also a lot of really great horticultural varieties as well. And this is a big topic of research right now is, are horticultural varieties just as efficient for and nutritious to pollinators as the native varieties? And while we're still, working on that research and figuring out the answer, if you see insects visiting those flowers, it's probably a great option for pollinators. Okay, different pollinators have different traits that they're attracted to in flowers. So bees, for instance, they love the bright white, yellow, blue, and UV colored flowers. They need either tubular flowers like this Rocky Mountain penstemon see that little bee inside. They also love flowers that have a landing platform. Versus birds, hummingbirds are going to be attracted to scarlet, orange, or even white flowers, and they need long funnel-shaped flowers. Butterflies love bright colored flowers, narrow tubes, spurs on the flowers, or landing pads. And moths and bats are nocturnal pollinators, tend to go for those pale colored, strong smelling flowers that open up at night. Now, with all the varieties of flowers on the market today, some of those flowers may not be as attracted to pollinators. So use this as a grain of salt, but you can use this as a guideline as well to pick out flowers for different pollinators. Bees specifically see a different parts of light than humans do. So bees can see that UV spectrum of light. So here's a few examples of what flowers look like to a human versus a bee. So here's the bindweed flower to a human versus a bee. So these are just some of my favorite native plants that I've been watching bees for many years now through Native Bee Watch. And I usually see bees on these flowers. This is by no means an all-inclusive list, just some of my favorites. Like purple prairie clover, attracts a wide variety of bees. Rocky Mountain penstemon, you'll see those green metallic sweat bees crawl in and out all the time. Cactus, Rocky Mountain bee plants, all those will attract a variety of pollinators. Plant Select, if you're not familiar with Plant Select, that's a collaboration between Colorado State University and the Denver Botanic Gardens to grow and propagate plants that do well in the Rocky Mountain region. So they're usually drought tolerant, they're beautiful, and they're well adapted. So some of these plants are going to be native. Some are maybe not native to Colorado, but native to North America. And then others may not be native, but they do well here in the Rocky Mountain landscape. These are some of the options that attract a lot of pollinators, a lot of great penstemon varieties. My personal favorite is moon carrots. Oh my goodness. When those flowers bloom, I will have like 10 to 15 different species of solitary wasps and bees visiting those flowers all at once, plus flies. It's amazing how much diversity moon carrot will attract. And there's a lot of great other pollinator-friendly plants too. Blue mist spirea is a great one. That's a bee magnet, and it does well. Just needs, sandy soil so that water can drain. Linden trees. Lindens are wonderful trees, but if you're in Colorado and you're in a Japanese beetle infested area, probably wouldn't plant linden, unfortunately, even though they are lovely trees. But you could look into catalpa trees or fruit trees, dogwoods. There are a lot of great options. I included weeds on here because that is important to note that you will see bees visiting bindweed flowers or dandelion flowers. And so if you treat those plants with herbicide, make sure to remove those flowers first. So when we think about pollinator habitat, so on the far left here, we have a green landscape, perfectly manicured and beautiful. But in those landscapes, there's no pollinator-friendly resources. There's no food or habitat spaces for those insects. So we want to strive for the middle and to the right picture. The middle is great. They've got their turf grass and they've got pollinator-friendly plantings. That can be a great balance. And then furthest to the right is our drought-tolerant, low-water, xeric landscape with lots of floral resources for bees. So it's good to find a balance and what works for you. For bees specifically, they need bare soil and cavity nesting areas. So leaving areas of bare soil without mulch has wonderful variety or wonderful benefits to the landscape. But if the mulch is too thick, bees won't necessarily crawl through there. So maybe consider adding mulch under your trees and other priority areas, but then leaving some bare soil areas for the bees as well. You could consider reducing lawn area. I always like to say, look closely at your lawn. Which parts of the lawn do you use and which parts do you not use? I have a dog. I love playing Frisbee with her. I'll always have our small patch of lawn space so we can play. But then, the areas of turf on the sides of your house that you're not really actively using, that can be a great place to add pollinator-friendly flowers and habitats. And I think we have to be creative too. We've got to provide spaces that we may not have thought about before. So whether it's in a park, a roadside, the side of your house, think about all the spaces that we could put pollinator habitats. I like to say that pollinator habitat is something everyone can take part of because they just need some flowers and some soil nesting area, and anyone can plant flowers. So it's really a thing that anyone can take part in, being part of the solution. If you're looking to attract butterflies, you'll want to find those caterpillar host plants. We have a great resource on our website, also butterfliesandmoths.org. Look at what the host plant is. And so here's a couple of examples. This is a two-tailed swallowtail and the caterpillar. Well, these caterpillars host on ash trees. And if you have emerald ash borer in your area, a lot of those trees will be treated with insecticides or they will be removed. So an alternative, they also host on chokecherries. So highly recommend if you're up for the task of managing chokecherry, that can be a great host alternative for these butterflies. Butterflies need sunny open areas and they also need shelter. So this is a good tip for birds too. Think about different layers in your landscape. So you've got your ground level perennials, your shrubs, maybe you have some conifer trees. All those different layers in your landscape provide sheltering areas for butterflies, for birds, for other birds that may not be pollinators, and wildlife as well. Everybody needs water. Specifically male butterflies will drink the minerals that are found in soil. So if you have like a wet, a mud puddle, you may see some butterfly activity there as well. Here's some other examples of caterpillar host plants. In your garden, if you plant dill, fennel, carrots, you might attract black swallowtail caterpillars. They're beautiful caterpillars, green, orange, and yellow. Morning cloak butterflies tend to host on willows, aspen, cottonwoods, and elms. painted ladies, thistles, hollyhocks, and sunflowers, and more. So this is just a partial list. This is a great example. I had a client call the extension office, and these little caterpillars were decimating his pansy plants. And so I knew what they were, and he was kind enough to bring the caterpillars to the extension office. I bought them their own pansies in a cage, reared them and released them. They had these beautiful metallic cocoons. I hope they'll come back to my landscape for sure. The white-lined sphinx moth, they're out already. You'll see this around. They host on a wide variety of urban plants. Pictured here is their native plant variety. This is out at the Plains Conservation Center in the Prairie. They will host on sand verbena. In urban areas, you might see them host on grape, elm, or apple trees. Hummingbirds, if you'd like to attract hummingbirds, a lot of people put out feeders. That is wonderful. Make sure you keep those feeders clean. Really, feeders are so humans can enjoy observing hummingbirds too. Long-term needs for hummingbirds are planting nectar plants that attract insects, because 70% of a hummingbird's diet is insects. And those hummingbirds are going to have babies and rear their young. Those babies need insects. That is protein for them to grow and develop. So planting nectar flowers, and also planting red long tubular flowers, particularly that are native to, can help hummingbirds quite a bit. They also need water as well. Bee hotels are a wonderful addition to the landscape. We don't have time to dive into the details, but I will say, make sure you're following best practices, because there's a lot of bee hotels out there that aren't necessarily the best for the bees. So my favorite fact sheet is from Michigan State University, and it will talk about all the best practices. University of Nebraska also has a great fact sheet on how to build and make and manage bee hotels. And these are great because there's very minimal risk for stings. You really have to like hold the bee or have it pressed up against your skin to get stung. You might see leafcutter bee activity in your landscape. Look at these perfect circle-shaped holes. Don't worry, that won't harm the plants. If you happen to see, like on your peonies or other plants, if you see these little notches, those are probably root weevils, and call your extension office for more information. But if you see these circles on a plant, know that it's supporting leafcutter bees. Okay, in this last minute or two, I want to cover 3 different campaigns that you'll see around. The first one is Pardon My Weeds, I'm Feeding the Bees. People are leaving their dandelions to feed the bees. And while, yes, you'll see some honeybees and even some little sweat bees feeding on the nectar of dandelions, research has shown that dandelions really aren't the most nutritious flower out there. So if they're feeding on dandelions, it's because there's nothing else that's better for them. And they prefer other plants. Like if you gave them a choice, they would visit other flowers before those dandelions. So yes, dandelions can support bees a little bit, but if we recommend taking it a step further and plant some early blooming flowers to support all the pollinators and provide a little bit more nutrition for them. No Mow May. I know May has passed, but I think it's worth mentioning. This is a campaign that gained a lot of traction. Don't mow your lawn for the whole month of May, because that will help pollinators and they'll visit flowers in your lawn. Well, really, in a lot of parts of the country, so like in Colorado, in our lawns, we actually don't have that many flowers that bloom in our lawns, and it's not necessarily the healthiest thing for the turf grass. So we actually don't recommend following No Mow May. A better alternative would be to find a place and plant some flowers and provide nectar sources that can last all season long for bees and pollinators, rather than not mowing your lawn. And if you've ever waited a month to mow your lawn, you probably know how difficult that is too. So No Mow May, probably not the best for pollinators or for your lawn. And then leaving the leaves, that can be a great thing. So once fall comes around, leave your leaves around your landscape. Leaves make great mulch, so you can put them in your perennial garden. Make sure you get them off your lawn. Put them underneath trees that can be great mulch, and a variety of arthropods will nest in those leaves, including queen bumblebees. But but it's really up to you how you want to do that. And it comes down to personal preference a lot too. The other question with this that I get a lot is, when do I do garden cleanup? And the short answer is, there's not an exact answer to that. And it's going to come down to personal preference. Pollinators, like all of our native bees, emerge at different times. So, you know, in May, we have a lot of our early season bees, and then their life cycle will come to an end. And then, you know, leafcutter bees will emerge, and we have these patterns. So it's not like everybody emerges all at once. So you definitely leave things over the winter, especially hollowed out stems. But once you're ready to do garden cleanup, feel free to, because there's really not an exact date on when gardens should be cleaned up. I mentioned this because I get this question all the time. How is climate change going to affect pollinators? Well, the short answer is every species is going to be affected a little bit differently. Some of the situations we may see with climate change moving forward, a phenomenon called phenology mismatch, where bees emerge when the flowers that they visit bloom. If the flowers start blooming earlier, but the bees emerge at the same time, you know, they may miss some of the window of when their flowers are blooming. Generalists will probably have an easier time adapting than specialists. Specialist bees, if they rely on specific plants or specific environmental conditions, they may struggle, particularly like our high elevation bumblebees. You know, as it gets warmer, some of our generalist bees might climb to higher elevations, but the ones that rely on high elevation weather, they may struggle a little bit. And so how can you help? The best thing is to plant more flowers all season long to support all the pollinators. If you want to know more, please look at nativebeewatch.org. There's fact sheets, webinars, field guides, and more on this website. So check it out. And to wrap up, I just want to say, this is just the beginning. So pollinators are a great way to help the whole ecosystem. By planting pollinator-friendly plants and providing habitat spaces, you're going to attract more beneficial insects to your landscape. And so this is a few pictures of some of my favorite beneficial insects. Particularly, look at this ladybug. I took this picture last weekend, and she is chowing down on an aphid. Makes me so happy. If you haven't seen a baby ladybug, this is what they look like. They look like little baby dragons. Don't kill them. That's just the larval form of a ladybug. Same with our lacewings. You'll see lacewings a lot this summer. They lay their eggs on these little stalks. The larvae have these huge pinchers to take down prey. And then one of my other favorite insects, this is a milkweed longhorn beetle. So if you plant showy milkweed in your landscape, you may see these beetles come around. They feed on the roots of the plant. They do not harm the plant. So pollinator-friendly plantings is just the beginning. You're also going to provide more bird habitat this way too. So the vast majority of terrestrial birds need insects to rear their young. One study by Doug Tallamy suggested that it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars for these little black-capped chickadees to rear one clutch of baby chickadees a year. So again, by adding pollinator habitat and those nectar flowers, you're going to help the whole ecosystem. This is a brand new field guide that we published last year. If you want to learn more about bees in your area, it talks about bees at a genus level of identification. Because for most bees, you need a high power microscope and taxonomic expertise to get to a species level. This will help you get to a genus level of identification. If you haven't seen our fact sheets, please check them out, especially attracting some butterflies to your garden. You want to know what those caterpillar host plants are. A couple of my favorite books. And on that note, thank you for bearing with me. I know we're 6 minutes over. I'll answer some questions. I appreciate you all joining me today. Thank you. All right, let's look at the questions. With all the rain on the Front Range, is that affecting solitary bee populations? You know, that's a good question. It's hard to say for sure. It's possible things are emerging a little bit later than normal. I don't think it's certainly not going to be detrimental long term. You know, we see ebb and flows in wild bee populations. So that part's totally normal. They may have a slight delay in emergence though. Like I've seen some queen bumblebees and I'm seeing them more now, but maybe not as many as normal, but that's very anecdotal and hard to say. We see tons of honeybees on our Apache plume. Do they keep the natives away? So I think you're asking about the native bees. So it really depends on the amount of floral resources available in the area. So I see honeybees on Apache plume too. I also see native bees on Apache plume. So if there's a lot of floral resources in the area, they probably aren't going to keep the native bees away. There's probably enough resources for everyone. But if floral resources are pretty scarce and the Apache plume, maybe that's one of the only food sources nearby, it could be the honeybees are using more of the resources than the native bees, but that's so nuanced and it's so hard to measure. It's hard to know for sure. Are there any other questions?
I think we've answered them as best we can. So thank you, Lisa. This was amazing. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and who's still on. As a reminder, this was recorded, and if you need to see some of Lisa's slides or plants that she listed, when you get the recording, just hit pause, do a screenshot. You can get the information that way. And then do please consider joining us every month on the second Wednesday at noon. But on behalf of CSU Extension, thank you, Lisa. Thanks to Tony and Amy. And we hope you have a wonderful afternoon going forward.